Greetings, everyone. This is Graham Walker coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. I'm welcoming you all to our Lighthouse Briefing today. In our Lighthouse Briefings, we invite our key friends and sometimes some supporters also to join us for basically a front row seat on how we are analyzing some of the topics of the day. So I welcome everybody who's joining us via this Zoom webinar, and we are grateful to everybody who's a member of the Lighthouse Society joining us today, and also grateful for those of you who may yet be about to become Lighthouse Society members. So today we're going to continue a conversation we began 3 months ago with Phil Magness of the American Institute for Economic Research. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks for having me.
So glad you're here. You were so interesting last time, we wanted to have you back again.
All right.
So, you better be boring today, otherwise you're going to get another invitation. So Dr. Philip Magness is a research fellow here with the Independent Institute, also senior research fellow at, as I said, the American Institute for Economic Research. He has taught public policy at George Mason, been affiliated with the Institute for Humane Studies, and he's been a pretty prolific author. Your latest book, Phil, is called 1619 Project, a Critique, right?
That is correct.
Okay, and a critique suggests that you're not entirely enthusiastic about the 1619 Project.
Strangely, I've kind of fallen into the place of being one of the public voices that is bringing it to some scholarly challenge to the claims that are made in that project.
There you go. That's the way. And of course, you're well suited to doing that because you are, in fact, an economic historian with a PhD in that area. And so that's not today's topic, but anybody who wants to know more about the 1619 Project ought to check out your book, which is available, I presume, on Amazon and is also on AIER, if I'm not mistaken. But then there's all sorts of other things that you've written, such as this book, which I want to get my hands on, Colonization After Emancipation, How Lincoln and the Movement for Black Resettlement. Especially interesting in view of Juneteenth, which
Right.
is we're honoring today. You've had 5 important articles in the Independent Review, our own scholarly journal, also published in the Journal of Economic History, Journal of Southern History, Journal of Business Ethics. You've been seen on Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, etc. So, okay. And with all that expertise behind you, you're an interesting person to talk to about the pandemic policy, I call them quagmire that we've been in for the past year and more, and the twists and turns that have occurred in public policy. How did you get interested in following this whole subject, aside from the fact that you didn't want to get sick?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a data scientist. I crunch numbers, I look for patterns, and I try to interpret them over time. And it turns out that, epidemiology operates in a lot of the same area. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't have primary training in that background, but I do work in statistical analysis, including some of the tools that were brought into bear by the epidemiology modelers themselves. And if you follow the history of where these tools came from, quite a few of them originated actually from economics and econometric techniques that were built up in the 1970s and 80s to study trends in the national economy's indicators and directions it goes, and also to study how economic interaction occurs. And they were adapted over by the epidemiologists in later years to look at the way that pandemics spread.
So you understand their tool set.
Oddly, I've worked in their tool set.
Interesting.
So, it's just one of the quirks of operating in social science is a lot of these mechanisms are shared, and you also start to see some of the pitfalls, the errors that people make.
Right, exactly. Well, I guess that's what we're going to talk about largely today. We promised our friends we'd talk about Dr. Anthony Fauci and some of the twists and turns in his approach to the pandemic. Just as a reminder, Dr. Fauci still serves as director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. He's been in that role since 1984, chief medical advisor to the current and former president, also advised every president since Ronald Reagan, and President Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Now, okay, a lot of people know those basic facts. Also, many people realize that, was it just, I think, last week, Phil, that Dr. Fauci who, at age 84 certainly has a lot of experience in these matters, or 81 rather, a lot of experience in these matters. He did make the interesting claim that to oppose or disagree with him on pandemic policy is to oppose science.
Right.
Did he really say that? What did he really say?
He did. It was an odd interview, and interestingly enough, he's kind of been shoved aside from the TV for the last couple of days, and I think part of it's the fallout from that interview. He basically had kind of what I refer to as his Senator Palpatine moment, where instead of standing up and declaring, "I am the Senate," he basically went on TV and said, "I am the science. And if you contradict me, you're engaged in an assault on science." So it's a proclamation of his own authority, and it's done so from a very hubristic perspective.
Well, I mean, he probably felt wounded by a lot of the criticism, and I guess he had to sort of reestablish his cred, right?
Yeah, including asserting it in a very authoritarian fashion.
La science, c'est moi, to quote a famous French king.
Yeah.
So he really did say that. And there's been other things come out recently, such as the interesting trove of emails. Many of us who don't follow things as closely as you do, we heard tell about these emails that were somehow strange or potentially incriminating. But we haven't spent the time. I haven't, and many of our friends, wish that somebody had actually read the emails and looked at them. Have you looked at some of those, and can you tell us something about them?
I have. I've poured over the emails. No, you should warn you that
I knew you would have done. I knew it.
Several thousand pages, so I by no means looked at them all. I don't think anyone has looked at them all. I just strategically tried to focus on key dates and the decision-making process to see what he was doing. And, if I were to summarize one theme of Fauci, when he goes on TV, he's always acting as if he's speaking from authority, if he has the scientific expertise, if he's the one guy that knows how to guide us through this thing. And yet, if you read his emails, it's the absolute opposite story that emerges there. Here is a guy that's confused, he's self-contradictory, he's vacillating all over the places. There are people that are giving him important information, and he's just kind of brushing it aside, not taking the time to read it. If you remember, about 6 months ago, Scott Atlas, who was the other coronavirus task force member under President Trump, made a statement and said that, you put these papers, medical papers, in front of Fauci, and he wouldn't really read them. He just kind of threw them aside. And here we have documentary evidence of that going on in his email chains as well.
Well, some people thought that Scott Atlas was just being kind of, persnickety or something when he said that about Dr. Fauci, but it turns out that some of it is very much documentedly true, right?
That is absolutely the case.
So, Scott Atlas, I hope you're listening. Yeah, so it revealed that he, in fact, set aside evidence that didn't seem to fit the themes he was publicly presenting. Did the email shed any light on the strange flip, which we discussed 3 months ago, in his non-advocacy of mask wearing? Did the email shed any light on that?
Yeah, there were several very revealing emails on the subject of masks. And if you remember, what we talked about 3 months ago was his public appearances. He went on 60 Minutes back in March of 2020 and said the public doesn't need a mask. Don't go to the store and buy masks. Just leave those for the medical professionals in the hospitals. And then, just 2 or 3 months later, he's not only advocating everyone has to wear masks at all times in public, outdoors, indoors, then he gets into double masking, triple masking, all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a major flip-flop because here's the guy that established himself as the spokesman for mask policy. First says, do not wear a mask. Then he does a complete 180, and he's on the other side of the issue. And yet when asked about that by the media, they throw him softball questions. He says, oh, well, I was just kind of telling a noble lie, a noble fib to the public because we were afraid the hospitals were going to be running out of masks. Well, it turns out if you look in the emails themselves, that's not his big concern at all. He actually does genuinely believe around February and early March of 2020 that masks simply aren't sufficient to do the job of making a meaningful dent on this virus. So he had one email.
So later he came up with the rationale that it was a noble lie to get
exactly.
That's strange. I mean, he could have made himself look better had he simply said, yeah, I thought one thing and then I thought something else. But
right,
instead,
or the new evidence came in, and we can debate what that evidence is, but instead he was trying to present himself as like this mastermind that was always in command of the situation. And I think that's a real theme for Fauci that's played out across his entire political career. And I will call it a political career.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, I did mention it's 40 years going back to advising Ronald Reagan even. And, you do wonder how a public career like that plays out and what the dynamics and forces affecting his decision making may be. And you can shed some light on that. Before you do, and I'm going to ask you to do that in just a second, but before you do, let me remind our participants today that you can indeed, on this private webinar today, which eventually we may be able to make public, as a recording, but today it's just you all with us on the line. You can ask a question directly to Dr. Phil Magness. You can go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, webinar screen, where it says raise hand, and you can click that thing. I will see your little raised hand, and I will open the mic for you to pose your question directly to Dr. Magness. That's really, I encourage you very much to do that. If you are shyer, you can click the thing at the bottom that says chat or Q&A, and you can type some questions in there. I'll see those as well. Okay, so I very much encourage our friends, and I see a list of them in front of me here. There's just a bunch of people. Some of them I know personally. Feel free, friends, to chime in. Okay, so back to Dr. Fauci. Many years, and you're trying, we wouldn't care, of course, about this subject were it not for the fact that he has had such profound influence over, the rules that govern our lives. So we do care, and we want to know what accounts for, the twists and turns in his career. What do you think has driven him in one way or another over the years? I mean, surely not everything he did was dubious. He must have done some good stuff too.
He's a very accomplished scientist. He's a doctor that has written multiple influential medical publications. And I don't doubt him when he says that he got into this line of work by wanting to do better for the world, by
Yeah, I
wanting
believe
to
that.
study diseases. And I still think he's motivated by that. At the same time, though, here's a guy that is a career politician. He's been in this office for almost 40 years. He's the single highest salaried employee of the entire federal government of the United States.
Wait a minute. Does that mean he gets paid more than the U.S. president?
He does. I think he has a salary almost in the $500,000 range per year, which is just astounding for a federal bureaucrat, taxpayer salary. So this is a guy that has been the quintessential Washington insider for 40 years. So I liken him career-wise to a figure like J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI.
Good comparison. Very good comparison. Because Hoover himself was drawn aside by some of the political incentives of his situation.
Absolutely. And Hoover's he's a guy that got into it because of law enforcement. He wanted to fight crime. Probably had all the right motives for doing that, but he became this entrenched figure that started to actually kind of pull the strings behind the scenes to manipulate policy, and that is always in the direction of keeping his agency well-funded and on top and in power. Mm-hmm. And you see the same thing in the NIH. So Fauci's kind of like the J. Edgar Hoover of the NIH. Here's a guy that controls billions upon billions of dollars in budgetary resources. And he obviously likes his job. He stayed around after the normal retirement age.
Right.
And he also seems to like the limelight that comes with it.
Yeah, he seems to be pretty good in front of the camera, except that he's gotten himself into trouble a lot of times in front of that camera. So I guess, it appears that Dr. Fauci, impelled by good motives, but very much in a politically sensitive, politically defined role, has responded to the various political incentives that he's faced and has sought to do one thing or the other. Now, normally you would say, well, what that means is that you would like toady to whatever president is currently in office. You'd want to say whatever he wants you to say. And that would be like a political explanation. But in Dr. Fauci's case, it's interesting. Some people say that he is one of those noble prophets who impelled by the common good, spoke truth to power during the Trump administration. I don't think you share that interpretation. What can you say about that?
I definitely do not share that interpretation. I think he's a very smooth and skilled political operator. And we've seen these guys, people of this type from history, not just J. Edgar Hoover. Another one I liken Fauci to was the first chairman of the Food and Drug Administration, and basically the creator of that agency, a fellow by the name of Harvey Washington Wiley. And he was an academic that came out of Purdue University around the turn of the 20th century, was hired to basically create and then ran the FDA. And he did so. He always presented himself as, well, I'm a scientist. I'm running experiments in my lab to make sure that food is safe. But if you read his correspondence, you look into the actual documents, he's wheeling and dealing and cutting favorable regulatory arrangements with companies that are basically sending him bribes and sending him free products behind the scenes. And one company will call and says, well, my competitor is really eating into my profit margin. Can you run a study that shows that their food is adulterated and is dangerous to the public?
That
And
really
he would.
happened?
That absolutely happened.
Wow.
There's ample documentation of it. And I'm not saying Fauci's quite that level of corruption, but what you do see with him is an operator in the bureaucratic sense that knows where his budget comes from, knows where his political power comes from. And if you're in one of these long-term roles that transcends not just one administration, but like the past 4, 5, 6 of them, your priorities change. The thing that's rewarded in the political spectrum of bureaucratic funding is people who come in and act like they're in control, act like they know the solution, act like they have an answer to every crisis that comes along. They're authoritative before the camera. They have a path or a solution they can give to Congress, the president, everyone else that's involved in the day-to-day decision making that says, I can manage this pandemic. I can manage this crisis. And that's what Fauci has learned to do over the past 40 years. The problem is he doesn't always have the information that matches the hubris that he's asserting when he's in front of a camera.
Yeah, right. I see that point. And what's interesting when you look at a public role like that, and well, temptations maybe, or at least incentives. There certainly is an incentive to play up to power, but in the case of the Trump administration, I think what we really learned from Dr. Fauci's apparent conduct there is that the power that seems to matter, certainly to Dr. Fauci, and maybe in a lot of other ways too, is the power wielded by the keepers of mainstream or elite opinion. He was not toadying to Trump. He was, at least how we say, responding to them. That is to say, the real long-term power holders that control a role like his is, in fact, elite opinion, mainstream universities, civil service, the press, and so forth. And he responded to that incentive.
Very much so. I mean, you got a guy that was doing basically fashion shoots on the covers of magazines that specialize in clothing.
Well, I don't know if that's fair, Phil. I mean, if he really wanted to do a fashion shoot, he would have probably looked a little better for the shoot. But we'll leave that aside. We'll leave that aside.
Going to the baseball game, throwing a pitch that is aimed at first base instead of the catcher. It's
okay. We're going to turn the corner and talk a little bit about modeling, which is part of this whole thing here. Let me remind our friends on the call, I'm still eager to have you toss me some questions for Phil Magness in the Q&A, or raise your hand using the raise hand function of the Zoom webinar. Oh, before I turn the page, got a question from a friend of mine named Sally. Sally, you can open your mic. I've just opened your thing up, and you can pose your question to Dr. Phil Magness. Just unmute yourself, Sally, and you can go. There.
Okay, I unmuted.
Great.
I wanted to know, I believe you're involved with the Great Barrington Proclamation. Is that correct?
So I attended the conference where that was issued.
Okay, I live in Great Barrington, so I'm very curious
just a neighbor.
about what that was all about. And I was aware of the nature of it, but I'm interested in what actions were taken from that, and were they
So the proclamation, for those that aren't aware, it came out of an academic conference we hosted at AIER back on it was October 4th, 2020. It was a very small gathering of 3 epidemiologists from Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford that came in to propose an alternative to the lockdown answer to the pandemic, basically an alternative to Fauci, an alternative to what the government was doing. And this is based on epidemiological knowledge of some very well-published experts that have been studying similar types of disease outbreaks for decades. And what they did is they tried to sketch an alternative path to dealing with COVID that they called focused protection. And the idea here is, rather than locking everyone up in their homes for months, shutting down businesses, schools, ending life as they know it for the vast majority of the population, you adopt basically targeted measures for known vulnerabilities. So the nursing homes, for example, were known very early on as being a point of vulnerability. People that have other diseases, comorbidities, so hospitals and things like that are points of vulnerability. And if you do a strategic focus on those areas of society, it also allows the remainder to open up. So that was basically the advice there. We didn't do this conference to specifically achieve anything like legislatively. It was more putting an alternative view out there in the scientific debate. And
It's important to point out here that the initial press reaction to the Great Barrington Declaration seemed largely to be, well, those Great Barrington people, they're anti-science. They want to throw everyone to the dogs of virus vulnerability. And in a headlong, heedless pursuit of herd immunity. That's how your declaration was spun.
yeah, it was caricatured. And even to the point, so John Ioannidis, who's another well-known scientist at Stanford, had an interview recently where he mentioned something of the Great Barrington Declaration. He was not involved in the conference, but he did some comparison to look at the scientific credentials of the main signers on both sides, because there was a competing petition that was put out called the John Snow Memorandum. This was the pro-lockdown side. These were the people that were presented by the media as having the mainstream viewpoint of how we deal with pandemics. And what Ioannidis did is he compared, if you look at the scientific signers, the Great Barrington Declaration's signers tended to be higher credentialed, had more publications and citations in the medical literature. Whereas if you look over on the John Snow memo side of things, some of the credentials were a little sketchier. I'll give you an example. Chelsea Clinton signed the John Snow memorandum as a public health expert.
Oh.
So
Wow.
the great medical expert Chelsea Clinton versus scientists at Oxford, Stanford, and Harvard that actually work on diseases and epidemiology.
That's too much even for parody. Good grief. Okay, so we've got a question coming from John. I'm just opened up your microphone, John. If you unmute yourself, then you can. There you go, John.
Okay, thanks so much. The Great Barrington Declaration really, I was amazed at the vitriol with which it was received and the partisanship. And more recently, more concurrent with that is the whole discussion around the origins of this virus, lab leak versus natural. And if you're not on the right side of that question, the responses you get. My question for you, Dr. Magness, is this historically unique, or did this happen in previous pandemics? Was there such a suppression of debate as we've seen recently?
Yeah, I think for modern times, it is a level of suppression of debate that actually harkens back to things we haven't seen with regular occurrences since something like the late Middle Ages, when there's a proclamation from the king or the church or the emperor that says this is the science, this is the astronomy, and everyone else is a heretic, which is actually kind of frightening. Although you do see in other areas, whenever there's a politically fashionable position assigned to one side of a scientific debate, the media very much goes all in for that one side. So the climate change discussion is probably the most recent example.
Right.
Some of the tobacco science, even in the 1980s and 1990s, fell into that trap. And so a lot of times these things resolve. But the oddity of what happened after the Great Barrington Declaration, and as you noted, we were just bombarded with vitriol. The very first week after the petition went live, there were actual scientists and journalists on the other side, the pro-lockdown side, that started flooding our site with spam fake signatures. They basically to create a news story out of it. I actually did statistical analysis and found when they were coming in. They all spiked at the exact same moment, about 3 days after the petition,
Wow.
when a journalist had issued a call and said, "Hey, flood this thing with fake signatures." And then 24 hours later, the Guardian's running an article about the fake signatures that these journalists created themselves to try and discredit the petition. So it's juvenile games.
Your comparison with medieval science versus religion is extremely illuminating, I think, because on this subject and others, as you noted, climate, and I can think of several other major public controversies, really the functional shape of the conflict, it feels and looks very much like the old one versus what we now look back on and say, those benighted people in the Middle Ages, they were all religious and they didn't want to welcome science. Well, it turns out that other things other than explicitly religious doctrine can acquire the spiritual prestige of what was once held by religious doctrine. And once those things acquire that spiritual prestige, then it becomes very difficult to hold on to a much more abstract commitment to evidentiary science and falsifiability. That's a hard thing to feel strongly and love compared to your spiritually significant commitment to whatever it is, climate alarm or one thing or the other.
Throw Fauci into the middle of that, where he's proclaiming, "I am the science," basically.
Yeah, there you go. It's the same
There's
thing.
an authority figure. That's not a debate. That's not inquiry. That is someone flexing their power.
We are just about to turn to a live question from Joe. Joe, I'm opening your mic so you can unmute yourself. I know he has a question about comparisons that you were talking about before. So Joe, if you're there, go ahead, Joe.
Yes, thank you, Graham. Good afternoon, Dr. Magness. I have a question regarding the lockdowns in terms of where the data is today and in current situation. I was watching the French Open over the weekend, and they still had people exiting at 10 o'clock at night and curfews and the whole bit. And I just wonder that, we have Florida as an example, we have other states as live examples, but yet some of these states and countries don't seem to have gotten the message. Is that because of the dogma behind it, or is it the censorship? I mean, do they not know the current standing of what the data has been saying?
There's a distorted lens that data has been presented to the public, both by the media and by government agencies, to basically support one side of the political debate. And it's not anything that's like by conscious design. It's rather they cherry pick their evidence. So reporters that support lockdowns cherry pick studies that support lockdowns, even if they're
you could even be more generous and say, well, they tend to gravitate toward the things that they may not even consciously be choosing it, but the things that they are gravitating toward reading.
Right. So the selection bias is throughout all of this discussion. And one of the things it's really exposed is the flimsiness of statistical analysis. We were already going into this pandemic with a novel virus of having very limited information and good data. This is something that a few of us were pointing out from the beginning, is even though stats seem to be flying every which way, very little of those statistical data points were reliable or tested or unbiased in their collection mechanism. And as the pandemic progressed, that improved quite a bit, but there are still people operating under assumptions that are, if not months, even a year or more out of date. And when you build that into some of your models, you build that into some of your epidemiology predictions, such as the Imperial College one, it sets us on a path dependency where the model can only give you the results that are as good as the inputs that were put into it over a year ago. And we're at a state right now where you got these models that are still generating increasingly absurd, increasingly far-fetched, catastrophic predictions of what would happen if, say, the United Kingdom reopens, or France or Germany fully reopens, if Canada removes its border restrictions from the United States. That was one I was looking at today. And they have all these catastrophic predictions that are no more grounded in evidence than they were in March 2020 when some of the initial mistakes were made.
Thanks. I think John has a follow-up question. John, if you want to unmute yourself, you can, unless I've misinterpreted your cue here. John, are you ready? If so, unmute. John can unmute. There's John. Oh, he was. Okay. Not quite sure. Okay, well, I've got a question in writing here from one of our friends, Perry. Perry asks, hasn't public health messaging generally, even before COVID, been more concerned with short-term clarity and certainty rather than trying to convey a more complex understanding? Does this help explain the power of unfortunate and even misleading messages such as "stop the spread," "wear a mask," "stay home"?
And this is an interesting dynamic I've looked into. So I'll give a partial answer of yes. I think the messaging in past uh, major health events, epidemics and pandemics and other outbreaks, has focused on very short-term measures that we can do to fix or address the situation as it's unfolding. But there was also a pronounced feature of the literature before COVID-19 that urged caution in taking bold, aggressive steps. I'll give you two examples. In 2019, fall of 2019, the epidemiology team at Johns Hopkins University, basically the main statistical source for most of the pandemic that we were all looking at daily, issued a report on respiratory influenza pandemics, where they very strongly cautioned against taking bold measures like lockdowns or mass quarantines based on information that wasn't complete. That was they basically said this is something that's prone to abuse. It's something that isn't warranted by the evidence and could create more problems than it actually purports to solve. And the WHO also had a report out in 2019 that basically argued the same thing for respiratory viruses. So there was always this caution that was built in to bold, sweeping, short-term measures to kind of counteract that political pressure. And that all flew out the window around mid-March 2020. Instead, it would seem to be supplanted by this precautionary principle style of argumentation, which it operates under the idea that, hey, if there's a 1 in a trillion chance of an asteroid coming and hitting Earth, we should operate under the assumption that we need to take measures to protect ourselves from that one event on the extreme tail. And the same thing was like, well, if this pandemic turns out to be as bad as the worst case scenario hypotheses happen to say, then we must do anything and everything without question to make sure that doesn't happen.
Wow. Okay, we've got another question from Joe. You want to follow up, Joe? I've opened your. There you go, Joe. You're free.
Thank you. Just on that same light, do you think in the future, if there is another pandemic, the response, you think the government will be able to get away with the response like this pandemic?
Certainly people that are going to try. I hope Anthony Fauci is long retired by then. But I do fear that certain politicians have seen this as a moment where they realized what they could get away with. On the other hand, there has been a growing level of skepticism about several of these policies,
Right.
especially in parts of the United States that are open, like Florida. Texas followed that suit. Georgia, other states that opened early. And if you remember the predictions, they were all as Fauci and Birx and all of these people on TV were saying that if Florida reopens, they're going to be ground zero for COVID catastrophe within a month. A month comes and that never happens. Texas reopens, they're going to be ground zero for catastrophe in a month. Never happens. Meanwhile, states that remain locked down, like New York and California, actually had worse case numbers and worse death numbers than some of the places that reopened.
Okay, to be fair, California is doing better now.
Now, it is now. But, like back in January, it was spiking at a level. And so on here, you have people like Gavin Newsom and Andrew Cuomo have actually started to reopen up their states because they saw what was going on in Florida. They saw what was going on in Texas and Georgia. And, you can only keep the illusion up for so long before people start saying, wait a minute, I have a cousin in another state and they're just back to normal.
Yeah. Now, I want to point one thing out. We're talking about the growth of skepticism toward the self-presented experts. That skepticism, as it turns out, regrettably, sadly, it turns out that skepticism has proved far more justified than any of us would have wished.
Yes.
And Phil Magness's work and many others has given the evidence for why that's so. But just notice what that means. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but with all of you, that the solution to the problem of inadequate, maybe not fully honest science is not less science, it's more. The solution to, bad assertions is knowledgeable assertions. And so we need more knowledge, not less. And Phil Magness's work, among others, illustrates the fact that when your experts and your intellectually sophisticated people seem to be going astray, the real antidote is not simply skepticism or, kind of pushing it away in a huff, but rather digging deeper and becoming more educated. And of course, that's what we are all about here at the Independent Institute. We cultivate and assist experts like Phil Magness so that actual evidence can be brought to bear against experts who are on the wrong track, rather than just, turning away from experts in a huff. I'd rather refute the experts than turn away from them in a huff. So I appreciate you doing that. I really do. There's a few more questions I sure don't want to miss. So Jane posed this interesting question. Earlier, I asked, Jane says, if you thought vaccination would be used to differentiate or discriminate among us. You answered no, because it's not obvious who's been vaccinated, as it is when identifying those wearing masks. That's a good point. Since then, Jane says, we've seen proposals for vaccine passports and other methods of discriminating among us. How do you foresee this vaccine controversy playing out from here?
This
Thanks,
is
Jane.
a very tricky issue, getting into the vaccine passports. And one point that I constantly make is vaccines are an amazing innovation that rapidly mobilized in response to this pandemic. But there's also politicization of the way that innovation took place. And now we've gotten into the territory where you basically have two strategies if you want to get vaccines rolled out and make them available. The one strategy, the one that I favor, is the free market one. It's the one the great Barrington authors advocated from the beginning, is to make vaccines widely accessible, provide sound information, urge people to make that voluntary step themselves, especially if they're vulnerable, if they're elderly, or they're in other groups where this disease seems to be a very severe risk for their well-being, because this is a tool that can mitigate that risk. So that's the one approach. The other approach is the command, top-down, centrally planned approach that unfortunately we've seen all too much of. This is mandates coming from the government. It's like, well, if you want to do this, you must get vaccinated. And then they get even stricter in what they're calling for. This is what we saw in New York State with an attempt to impose vaccine passports. There are some people that have argued that vaccine passports are a private solution as well. I don't see that happening because government has a tendency to co-opt mechanisms like this.
Right.
Even if you had a well-run, well-designed vaccine passport system coming out of the private sector, that's just that's like throwing up a flare signal to Congress saying, "Come in and co-opt this through a bureaucracy and let's impose it nationwide." So I worry about that kind of a tendency, the political creep, the regulatory capture that's coming out of it. So that's where the biggest danger I see is.
Yeah, Bob Higgs called that the ratchet effect. With every crisis, there's more politicization and more government power. And so, of course, from time to time, situations do arise when there's a temporary emergency and, somebody has to take the lead. Maybe, for example, the Operation Warp Speed was a justifiable push. But whenever a government resorts to those kind of temporary pushes, everybody needs to be extraordinarily vigilant to prevent that becoming a permanent politicization of the issue. And unfortunately, our history, especially in the 20th century, illustrates the way, in the early 21st, obviously, illustrates the ways in which crises become occasions for the permanent politicization of various functions. And when things are politicized, when they run not on consumer choice or the power of persuasion, but they run on government mandate, things are going to go wrong. It's just the way it is. We've got, okay, here's another question. Oh, this is a hot potato. This is from our friend David. I think David from Monterey, if I'm not mistaken. He says, since the Japanese government has apparently decided to prohibit foreigners from attending Tokyo Olympic events, as the Wall Street Journal reported today, should we pull our support from the Olympics? Well, let's just say I'm not sure that your expertise requires you to take a position on that, but you can take a stab at it if you want.
I guess what I will say is I tend to view the Olympics as I do most other publicly supported sports boondoggles. They are usually operations that are lucrative to people that are in the business of building stadiums and amenities and local municipalities and city
And the
governments.
worldwide broadcasting rights.
Entirely. So there's money involved in all of these things. Unfortunately, they're often sold to the public. You know, like when a new sports stadium comes into town, when there's a proposal, it's like, oh, the public should pay for this because we're going to get all these economic benefits that come from it. And even under the best of circumstances, those benefits are never realized the way that they're promised. Take something like the Olympics, and then you start to say, well, you can't have tourism to the Olympics. You can't have international visitors to the Olympics. That's not only continuing the boondoggle effect. It's also eliminating the one thing that could potentially offset and recoup some of the public expenditures. So
Right.
now there's no longer even an economic argument for investing public monies in this large sports extravaganza.
So, David, that sounds kind of like a yes to your question.
I think so.
Phil, I think we have time for me to just delve into one other dimension that I really wanted to ask you about. We had talked 3 months ago about, the scientific and epidemiological modeling that had occurred on which a number of these public policies were based. Can you tell us about how the modeling is holding up since we last talked?
Absolutely atrociously. So I've focused the majority of my attention on the most influential model, and that's the Imperial College model from Neil Ferguson out of London. This was the guy that, if you remember him, he urged lockdowns on the world. He convinced both the Trump administration and Boris Johnson in the UK to adopt them in mid-March of last year, and that was like the signal to every other country. Well, the Americans and the Brits are doing this, so we need to lock down. He was also the guy that, like 2 weeks later, was caught sneaking out of his house to go visit his mistress. So he wasn't really abiding by his own lockdown measures. But for some reason, this guy has remained the leading modeling voice that's influencing governments across the world. What's happened since the last time we discussed him is that we hit the 1 year anniversary of the Imperial College model, both the one that the US and UK used, and then about a week later, they released a model, their similar model for every country that they had data on, so almost 200 countries. And they all predicted the exact same catastrophe. That happened on March 26, 2020. On the 1 year anniversary, March 26, 2021, I sat down and I compared the performance of what the projections were into the Ferguson model versus what actually happened. And not a single country on Earth came close to fitting his scenarios. Even the worst case scenarios, even countries that have had really bad runs like Belgium, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Peru, these are countries that were hit really, really hard by the virus and hit hard during lockdowns. Even them, they only come close to some of the scenarios that don't really fit the parameters of what they did in terms of policy. And then on the other end of the spectrum, some of them are just absolutely absurd in the level of how wrong the predictions were. There were some countries that he overstated the number of deaths that they were expected to incur, even under lockdowns, by tens of thousands of percentage points. One
and
case even
remind
topped
us,
a million.
Who was it again that made these predictions?
Ferguson of Imperial College London.
Okay, so I get confused with the UK personality. There was the Dominic Cummings, who was
he's the government guy that okay. got in the mix of all that.
So you also have compared not only with the UK but with other countries on how things have been going with the modeling and so forth, the catastrophes. I just wanted to draw people's attention to this really interesting piece you published just, I guess, last week, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to pull up a copy of it so people can see it here. Imperial College predicted catastrophe in every country. Then the models failed. Very much worth looking at. This is at your own website, aier.org. So comment a little bit about the other comparisons.
You actually go to that article. There's a downloadable spreadsheet so you can see where your country falls on the predictions, and you can see just how off Neil Ferguson's model happened to be. And as I said, every single one of them is just catastrophically wrong. But what we're seeing here is also a theme. because the errors occur not only in countries that are hard hit, they also occur in countries that did not have a bad run with the coronavirus and everything in between. This is where the outlier cases of countries that did not lock down or that used a lighter touch. So the famous examples are Sweden, which is hit hard by the virus, but it never locks down.
Right.
Japan, which is not hit as hard by the virus, at least until very recently. It also doesn't lock down. It remains mostly open. South Korea had a light touch approach. Taiwan had a light touch approach. These are countries that were championed for various reasons as success stories, but they didn't have anything approaching lockdowns. And it turns out that the Ferguson model was basically predicting COVID apocalypse coming across every single one of these cases, and it didn't matter what policy they adopted. The outcomes that they had just weren't anywhere near what he was modeling, and that just tells you right there it's a real world, real time live experiment of the performance of the models against their claims, and nothing is lining up. And then you start asking the question, okay, this is the guy that advised world governments on what to do in response to the coronavirus, and we followed his advice and are still following it a year later, and yet every prediction he had, he blew.
Why am I only reading about this on the AIER.org website and not on the Washington Post?
Because the Washington Post has been very credulous in its repetition of talking points coming out of Ferguson's unit at Imperial College. As have politicians. Politicians that bought into this, the last thing they want to do is admit that they were wrong.
That's amazing.
It's sunk cost, it's path dependency. I did actually catch, and you can read it in this article, I caught Imperial College itself, its PR office, in an outright lie.
Oh.
Because they got into some trouble before the House of Lords. Ferguson was testifying. And the Viscount Ridley, Matt Ridley, some of your readers may know from his books on scientific matters, asked Ferguson why his model failed in its predictions for Sweden.
Okay.
And then Ferguson answers him and says, well, we never predicted Sweden. That was another university that adapted our model to Sweden, and they must have gotten their parameters wrong, so you can't blame me for that. And Imperial College sent out tweets and press releases saying that Professor Ferguson never modeled Sweden, because the claim was that this model showed 85,000 deaths in Sweden at a time when they had only hit a couple thousand, and even today I think they're at 14,000 right now. So he had catastrophically wrong over prediction for Sweden. And Ferguson said, well, I never did that. I take no credit for that. Well, it turns out if you go on the Imperial College's website, their own website, you can pull up the data appendix to these reports when the models were released, and there it is, along with every other country, the model for Sweden, and it says something like 84,500 deaths are predicted in Sweden. Neil Ferguson's listed as the corresponding author on this study, and his entire team is a part of the publication.
Good gracious.
So, yeah, you have the university itself lying to cover up its own work.
Now, for clarity's sake, I just want to point out that you're referring to Neil Ferguson of Imperial College, not Niall Ferguson, also an English scholar and economic historian who's at Hoover Institution. These are two different people, and the one, Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, is the one that Phil Magness is pointing out. Well, we could go on for a long time here. I don't see any more last-minute questions from our friends. I encourage them to follow your work. Also, I'm grateful that really, Phil, the people on this call are key among those who make possible the work of the Independent Institute, thus supporting your work and many others. Independent Institute is the place to go, really, for sober, well-considered resistance to some of the political and even scientific hysteria of our era. For example, you can see behind my shoulder our recently published book, Hot Talk, Cold Science, which is very much worth considering. Here it is right behind me, on the whole question of climate catastrophism and trying to bring to bear a more sober assessment of the evidence. You're doing that with regard to the epidemic. We have partnered with others, such as the National Association of Scholars, to really emphasize the importance of falsifiability and testability in science, a commitment to evidential science is very important, really in every field, not just the physical sciences, also the moral sciences. We live in a universe where there are hard facts, both physical and moral, and we ignore them at our peril. We try and make that clear throughout a variety of disciplines, especially economics, and we're grateful for your work in economic history, Phil Magness. We're very grateful. And thank you for all of our friends who joined us. Please come back for our next Lighthouse Briefing. And of course, you can always go to our website, independent.org, and renew both your information banks and your support for us as you see fit. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day. Goodbye from the Independent Institute. Take care.